Thank you very much, Ron. I think you raised, in the end of your presentation, you raised or you made somehow the link again to how we started this panel, or what I said in an introduction, that we necessarily need to look into the relations between the different colonial empires, but also into how these relations persist until today, and how we can follow the objects or the bodies that move in between these places, and what this also tells us about societies today and about their relation to the stories that could be told, right, but they are very often not told. So I just an organizational thing, how we will proceed, or how I would propose that we proceed with the panel, is that I will not take up the position of the moderator too much. I think it would be nice if we would have a discussion among all of us and also with the audience. So I invite you all. Unfortunately, I cannot really see you, but please raise your hands if you have questions or comments, and we have a microphone in the room that will be passed around, so please give a sign or even give a shout if you want to join in. But maybe
actually,
yeah.
Before we go to a question, I just would love to respond to something you made mention of before, of how this isn't just a direct link and chain of returning sacred remains and artifacts back to the communities, that we're often have gatekeepers in the colonial institutions back in our own country. And I find this is specifically the case in Australia because we don't have our own cultural institutions. We're always at the mercy of the Australian Embassy, the government, and these national museums. And some are quite progressive in their in the ways that they keep objects and collections. We're looking at an emerging time where we have this renaissance of culture and self-governance, and a lot of our tribes reasserting their sovereignty, and that it's going to be a real challenge for European institutions of, are they willing to have the courage to say no to the Australian state and do what's right and just return these objects back to the people, where we can quite often very easily prove that it's where it's supposed to be anyway. So I just wanted to say that.
Well, I would say that in the case of Benin, the artifacts or the works that were taken away from the bedchamber of the king and the shrines, it's very clear that, yes, this in present-day Nigeria, they belong to the state. But even then, all the returns that have been made have actually been made directly to the palace. The case of Adrian Walker, his grandfather was a part of the British forces that overtook Benin. But he brought the works back to the same palace where the works were taken away in 1897. The other collection, the other works that were brought back, that were repatriated during the time of Obakenzwa, were also given to the king in the palace. There's this other side to it, that the collections in public institutions, that is usually government to government. And so most of the museums, Western museums, are dealing directly with the cultural institutions in Nigeria. Unfortunately, we do not have a very clear case of the officials there being very transparent about whether they really want these works returned or if they're just paying lip service. But I know there's a lot of colonial mentality in those structures that we have as government bodies in Nigeria. So there's some kind of disconnect between those institutions and the royal family in Benin. But I think that there has to be a more organized, perhaps, way of bringing it together. Because the case of Benin is not just the lone case of theft or plundering that went on in Africa. We also have the case of the Ashanti Kingdom of Kumasi that was plundered in 1874, where a lot of gold works were taken away, by hundreds gold artifacts. So I think that this is a time where some of these countries can come together and present one voice.
Hello, thank you for all your talk. Very interesting, fascinating. And, oh, by the way, my name is Ginga Eichler. We joined the same profession. I also study African affairs. And, but your talk, I have the question, who paid for the so-called tribal museums? I guess in the homeland of Native Americans. Because we just had a talk during lunch that I remember many years ago already, the big debate was, well, we kept all these items, we kept all these artifacts, this wonderful art in our museums. If they stayed in Africa, if they would have stayed in Africa, they would have been rotten all these years. And thank you very much, ma'am, that you mentioned how the things were kept in your community, in your family. So I think it is absolutely necessary, and we should include this in our demands also to the German government if it comes to giving back things which were stolen, giving back art which was stolen, giving back skulls which were stolen, that we should also pay for it, because we are the one, our ancestors are the one who took them away and killed people for it. So it should not be left to, even not to African governments to spend the money on that, but we should pay on it. And I wonder what you think about it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that remark. I'm not sure where a lot of the funding came for tribal museums. I think that the tribal museums in most cases paid for their own museum construction. And I do recall that there were donations that were given by some wealthier tribes to others. The Pequot tribe on the East Coast had a very profitable casino, a big casino. They made millions. So in a way, what we can see in that situation is the sort of collecting bug, and the addiction to collecting was replaced by a gambling bug and another kind of addiction that then paid for the repatriation of those objects that were collected. So I think my sense is that the tribes were largely responsible. Now, how does this translate to the claims that are being made, to the German government? My feeling is very strong that, they've made offers to the Ova Herero Nama for bringing some of the German technology to Namibia, not as a reparation, but as a gift of the German government. But a special effort, right? So what would be how difficult would it be to construct institutions, even research institutions in Africa, that could provide another model for dealing with these artifacts and returning them giving access to the communities from whence they originate? I think that it's a reasonable claim to make.
I think we're in a really difficult position in Australia because first and foremostly, we don't have a philanthropy culture. When we look at museums and galleries and cultural institutions for our art and our history, the vast majority of funding is coming from the mining industry, which represents all kinds of conflicts of interest. We were never given treaties. We have no form of real land rights that can provide the royalties for establishing our own institutions. The first foundations of our first medical and legal services came in partnership with the international community, and we proved quite well that we can do very efficient things with very little amounts of money. The vast majority of funding into Aboriginal welfare and culture is all hidden in games of statistics, because they do this thing where they merged the entire budget of Australia's funding for disadvantaged people and claimed that that's money going into Aboriginal funds because we just classify as disadvantaged. So the money that's going into everyday mainstream Australia is somehow earmarked as being for Aboriginal people, despite it never ending up anywhere near us. And this entire development industry still built on paternalistic notions of controlling our own affairs. So very tiny drops of this money ever reaches the ground, and alleviating that fear of the institutions out here, that we're not here to clear out your cupboards. It's fantastic that you've managed to save and keep some of these things, but we don't want your axe heads and your random spears. We want our sacred objects, we want our remains, we want our shields that represent the hereditary lines and the sigils of our families. We want the things that are important, and we'll develop that relationship to help build your collections better. Hell, we'll even give you some new stuff you didn't have before. But alleviating that fear and also working to the point that we do need that help to create those independent institutions, but not that we're just coming out to beg. Hell, we have such an amazingly strong history of resistance that we have survived one of the longest running genocide and eugenic projects in the world, and we're still here. We still have our culture. We still have our stories. Our old people tell stories of the glaciers and the ice ages, that we have the longest continuous history in our paintings of the Kimberleys of 50,000 years non-stop, from those dawn times to when the people on the settlers came on their boats, the longest continuous historical records in the world. This isn't just an issue about our culture, this is world heritage that we're talking about, and it's something that's important to all of us.
I think one of the arguments against repatriation of Benin bronzes is that Nigeria does not have proper museums to keep these works, and that the museums are in very bad state. I would say that when works were returned to the palace of the king, the works were not kept behind show glasses, because that's not where they belong. The regalia of the king was assimilated into the sartorial traditions of the palace. I showed the images of the king. When he had the ceremonial, when he had his coronation, he actually decided that he would visit all the sacred spaces and perform all the rites before he ascended the throne of his father. So the ceremonial swords are still very much in use. Items of regalia, the gongs and things that were, given back to the king are still very much in use. So they forget that the museums, the idea of having these artifacts or these objects is not to be kept in those kind of spaces that you're used to seeing. These are sacred objects that should be used and kept within the confines of the palace. So the whole argument about having a museum, and sometimes you find that even the museums in Nigeria are not really very well visited by people because they don't have the tradition of going to see sacred objects behind show glasses. So if you say, for example, that we should have local museums different from the ones that the state founded, then we might be thinking about the king setting up a palace to keep some of the cultural artifacts that come over time, or some of the personal effects or things that are used for ceremonies that go on in the palace all year round for people to see. But definitely, we do not have that culture of keeping works that are sacred. Ceremonial objects are used in performance. Basques are used in performance and not kept frozen behind show glasses.
I mean, you're still very much welcome to join in the discussion. And maybe I want to pick up something that Roxy said in the beginning. Sorry? You said we need to build a real relationship. And I think this is something that, when I first heard of this conference, I think this was one of the main ideas that stayed with me, because I thought this would be the perfect time and the perfect coming together to actually think about real relationships, what they could be like. And I think we don't have to have a discussion about I mean, we need the specific cases to think about them, but I think we should also think about how these different cases can relate to each other, and maybe think about ways of strategies about how to engage with each other and how to come to these relations that go beyond the relation between institution and communities, but also like how to engage with each other. So there's, I think, one question from the audience here.
Yeah, thank you. I don't know if the case fits the question, the theme we are talking about, but if you think that fits, I would like to hear your opinion. Who do you think will pay for Palmyra reconstruction? Is it a case that fits here or not? Thank you.
You mean the reconstruction of Palmyra at the location, or because there is?
Or as a thank you, as art, or again, art or religious important heritage that belongs to humanity itself or history itself, and now is destroyed. And what will happen then? If it doesn't fit the case, then we can go on. Thank you.
I apologize that I'm not familiar with the particular case, but it does bring up an important case of who is funding for repatriations, who's funding for rebuilding these histories. That we have to look at a lot of different elements here. And as I said before, we're very much reliant on the mining industry, which is horrible if you consider a vast amount of our indigenous scholarships are paid by mining. Often the anthropological studies our people are doing to rediscover their own history, family and culture is then turned against them and used by those mining companies to disprove land claims. For our case, we have to look towards Britain as well. Britain still holds a responsibility towards what's happened in colonisation. Australia holds a very significant position. Their entire wealth of their nation is built on stolen resources, yet they claim poor when it comes to any element of funding culture or revival practices. But more importantly, we don't want to be dependent. If we had our land rights, we would have the economic independence to do these things ourselves. And at the end of the day, land rights was about the economic independence of communities. And we shouldn't be in a position where we have to cry poor, we have to beg, or we need the help of the international community. But if we're not going to see that at home, we're not in a position where we can wait for another 10 years, because we'll lose another generation. We'll lose the knowledge of our elders. The old Malcolm X theory, by any means possible.
One of the things to keep in mind when we're looking at wars of destruction and international human heritage is that the international legal system is basically yes. The international legal system is basically anarchy. The responsibility for a lot of things that go on are up to states, and there's a lot of deference to state members. And if the state or the region is in a situation of intractable warfare, or the state is non-cooperative, there's nothing that UNESCO can really do to further a project of reconstruction. So even if there were funds available from the international community, even if UNESCO could finance the reconstruction of a World Heritage Site, I'm not sure it would be able to under some circumstances.
Hello, my name is Rochelle Bramdo. I have a question for Mr. Foley in particular. That first I want to say thank you for your very brilliant talk. But what I'm very interested and curious about, which is a very slight diversion from our subject, is that what about religion? You know, Jesus Christ and Christianity is a European religion, and I, as a woman, I grew up as a Hindu, but because I went into a Christian a foster family, the Christian foster family changed my name, changed my identity, and changed all the little things that I took from my home. And the things I took from our home are the little artifacts like the God lamp. And by lighting the lamp every night at a certain time, you give reverence to that. But to cut a long story short, you said that you have your culture, but I think a big part of Australia is also a very Christian country, like South Africa is. But so when we talk about sacred objects, all those things that we use for Hindu prayers, like the God lamp and the incense, these are all considered satanic, because the only real God is the man who bleeds on the cross, who I feel very sympathetic for. But this is a very big problem, I think, because a lot of the sacred objects in homes and things that people did with bones and with the dances and with the songs they sang, all of that is also just disappeared, which probably doesn't. We can't hold the European museums responsible for this, but I think the thing that we can hold responsible for this is this religious aspect of it, which I've never heard anyone talk about in my research about colonialism. Thank you.
It's in part a subject I shy away from because I don't want to trip up on my positions of what cultural law I can speak on and what that I can't. There's an old saying that if we have to spoon feed you the knowledge or tell you the answer straight out, the knowledge isn't going to be respected. That's why the elders always tell you things in metaphors and stories and riddle, because you have to think about it. And it amazes me that we have this Christian society imposed on us that can't see the fact that their book is a bunch of metaphors as well, and where ours is painted as some kind of primitive and savage little worthless story, yet they don't see the deeper connections. All of our art and culture and spirituality is all interconnected. It's not a European defined state of one or the other. It is all the same. And that's why we talk a lot about you can't whitewash our art and culture from the political struggles of dispossession and land, because all of our knowledge, art and culture is inherently tied to our land. And when we have been completely removed from our land by the Christian missions, when they created reserves in our country, they didn't just create a reserve in your area. They took you hundreds, if not 1,000 kilometres away from your land and completely displaced you to make sure you couldn't run away and you couldn't get back to a point of economic sufficiency in your own lands and go hide and start a rebellion or something. But that damage is thorough. And just the other day I was having a go on social media that if you look at many of the major family names throughout our country, you'll find that those are the family names of the priest or the mission managers or the protection board managers. We've actually, in the very core of our identity, our last names, we carry those chains and legacies of the oppressors and our abusers, living proof of the rape and sexual servitude of our women, being forced to carry this on in generations. And we see that too, where a lot of the old people, they mix up the old Chukapa law with Christian spirituality, and you get these weird mixes. And it's definitely a fight, because we're going to be at a point where the only history in our culture we have left is what's been regurgitated through Christian missionaries and through capitalist views of what our culture is, and then that's all our children will be left with. But I also have to say that in some cases, these missions have actually saved some of our culture. Back in the Ghana lands, there was actually a couple of German missionaries, I think. They tried to teach God to our people, but very quickly realised we had our own stories of creators and that we didn't need to be taught anything. And that they started recording all of our stories in language. And that was one of the reasons we were able to repiece and revive the Ghana language in the last few decades. It's a very complex sort of issue but yeah, Christianity does not help.
Yeah. It's also the same situation. It's also the same situation in Nigeria. Christianity is a problem. When it comes to appreciating cultural values, it's actually eroding cultural values in Nigeria. When the European missionaries came, they came with this knowledge of God, and they told the locals to bring out any of the fetish objects, their gods, and they created very dramatic bonfires, burning, priceless sculptures in wood and other materials. It is a problem, but you'll find that in Benin, we still have traditional worship still being done, and people, still have value for their belief system. But alongside that, you have the Christians who, castigate everything that is African. So if you dance, you are told that it's vulgar, it is fetish. If you sing, you are singing heathen songs. So they don't want to see any of these objects. So that also exists. But I think that what needs to be done is to get people to understand that these are works or objects that capture historical time. This was the time when these things were done. This is what they represent. Just like it's being told here, we want to tell our own stories as well. And the Christian experience is part of being colonized. Without colonialism, probably wouldn't have had Christians in Nigeria. But it's really a problematic situation.
I think I also just want to point out there that although Australia claims to be a Christian nation, it's not if you look at the demographics. That's just a representation of the kind of apartheid processes of who holds the power balances in Australia. So there's a bigger conversation there.
Oh gosh, the microphone's coming to me. I thought I was going to get out of this one. So I think that the place of missionaries and Christianity in the settler colonialism of North America is fairly clear, and I write about this in my book Spirit Wars. Missionary collectors were oriented towards not just promoting Christianity, but undoing the foundations, spiritual foundations of the societies in which they worked. But there's a more complex wrinkle to the spiritual relationships between dominant societies and native or indigenous societies, manifest in the New Age movement, which of course is alive and well, in which the significance of sacred objects is sort of reassigned and appropriated. So there's a, and you might have experienced this in Australia as well, that there is in a lot of what we're dealing with, we're not just dealing with objects as objects, but we're dealing with ideas associated with these objects. And the ideas that are traveling between one community and another, between a settler society and those that are subjected to its power. And in a relationship of Christianity or New Age appreciation of cultures, the ideas are complex. They move in more than one direction. And in current circumstances, we're seeing a repossession and a reappropriation of not just the objects, but of the cultural ideas and spiritual ideas that are associated with them. Yeah? We'll leave it there. Whew, I got away.
Maybe just a very, very brief note to the question of religion and coming back to the Humboldt Forum, because we were talking about this earlier. There's also there is a discussion, or I mean, the discussion is not really held so broadly in Berlin. During the ceremony of the putting down of the first stone, the first stone was baptized by a Catholic and a Protestant priest, like two different persons. And a discussion that happened in the beginning of this year was a question if a cross should be put on the dome of the building. So I think this is also one of the discussions that are not resolved here. And I just wanted to kind of put this in the room, because I think it's important to see how this museum is still framed in a kind of a Christian realm. So there were more questions from the audience. I think
I
there's
would just
1,
like
2,
to
3.
very quickly talk about the practical methods to repatriate artifacts. The Nagpra in the United States is a domestic law, and so with that comes Native Americans pay taxes, they vote. So in that sense, that legislation, I mean, it was domestic, so it happened, and it's something much faster and easier in a lot of ways than the Edo and the Benin artifacts in Germany. And my question is, you stated earlier that you have to, only governments can request the repatriation of artifacts from governments. I have interviewed people at the Humboldt Forum and mentioned this to them, and their response is often, we see the ethical issues, we recognize them, but we're not the people who can really make these decisions. And so in essence, Nigeria would have to ask Germany. And when I did research, and you even alluded to it, that Nigeria doesn't support this repatriation, this isn't an issue. The Edo state didn't present this as an issue on their webpage or in any formal addresses, which I've found. So in a practical sense, what could be done to make these repatriation claims via UNESCO and the systems that are set up to make those claims? Is there any plan to do that? Because this year and last year, we always make the ethical argument, but I feel the ethical argument everyone agrees with, and that's not what's holding up so much as this process, which, like it or not, is the process which is recognized that will get this done.
Yeah, thank you very much for that question. I would say that it might not appear on the web pages, but I know that one of the ministers for culture had come to Berlin and he had made a case for Nigeria, demanding for the works to be returned. I did say earlier on that, yes, there had been other issues that had gone on. And the way the National Commission for Museums and Monuments has handled the case of the Benin bronzes, it's very difficult to say exactly where they stand. But I know that there are also other heads of cultural institutions in Nigeria that have taken this very seriously. And if you look in the appendix of my book, you'll get to see letters written by one of them, Professor Babawale, Tunde Babawale, who was the head of the Center for Black African Arts and Civilization, which is a government parastatal in Nigeria, who had written asking for the works to be returned. So if you look at some of Kwame Okpoko's writings, he would tell you that despite the fact that, yes, you're asking that government should write, you also should recognize that the Oba of Benin is also a very powerful force, requesting for the return of his heirloom. And there have been several attempts to even present at the British Parliament for the case of the return of Benin objects. So it is not true that the government is not interested. This is something that they're very interested in. How they've gone about it, one might say, that they need to put in more efforts, which I believe also. But I think that they have made a case for the return of Benin works.
Thank you very much. I wanted to respond on the issue of Christianity. Because I think when we talk about Christianity, there's no way that we can link it to colonialism. Of course, it is linked to colonialism. Back home in Namibia, I know that at the moment we have like thousands churches in the name of Christianity that also have become commercialized. It's a business now. But the point is that besides the Namibian people also claiming to be 95% Christians, I really don't think that is the true reflection, because there is no research that has been carried out to prove that 95% of Namibians are Christians. But I think this was put in the heads of people to believe that we are all now becoming Christians and we have to, pray and all these type of things. But in the community that I'm coming from, there is still a strong belief in their sacred objects and sacred places. For example, the Herero people have what they call the holy fire. And that is something which is still very, very sacred. Early in the morning, the head of the house will go to this sacred place, lit the fire, say good morning to the ancestors and so on. We also have, during weddings, fat or oil that is being made from the milk, which is called omade wodongombe. It's also something very sacred, and it's being used when the one who's getting married, they said the groom or bridegroom, I don't know these things right now. The bride, they also use that as a way of welcoming this person and so on. But the point, when one links it to colonialism, is that it is somehow also bringing some tension and conflict within the community members themselves. Those who are so-called Christians and those who are saying, but I do believe in my ancestors and so on. There is some tension now. And that tension, one can also blame that on colonialism, because if Christianity was not introduced or imposed even on people, because it was imposed, that's why I'm Esther, because of baptism that was also linked or associated with that. So these are still things that have impact and, effects on the current daily living amongst people in communities. So, and I think it's a good point that my sister Rochelle brought up, and I really think that as researchers, we also need to start moving into this issue of Christianity and colonialism and the daily living of people, right now. Thank you.
I just want to quickly reply to that, and I'm probably going to get myself in trouble here, so I'm going to hope that no one back home is watching. But one of the biggest problems I find with Christianity and with Europe is how it's divorced you from your own heritages. When I look at my culture back home, which is so long unbroken, I find this beautiful bridge to all of us around the world, that we have these pattern and essences of our culture that we see replicated everywhere. And you'll find it here if you go back long enough. I find it funny being in these collections in Dresden where they have all these stolen artifacts of August the Strong, and I laugh at them. It's like, you call this old, it's 400 years old. Show me something actually old. I want to see your connections to your heritage of this land. But this thing with Christianity, what is your definition of the sacred? Because this is all sacred. Everything in our world is sacred. Everything has spirit. And this is why we talk to you about wanting to awaken your collections, because as they stand at the moment in these museums, the spirit of these artifacts are crystallized into this narrow point of view where the spirit sleeps. We want to help bring the people whose culture is represented, because it's only that interaction of the understanding and the will that the spirit and what this means of the object awakens and enlightens those around it. As long as you just have these anthropologists giving their perceptions, it's going to sit there in this narrow view. If we're truly going to have a link and understand these items and let them shine, you need to have the people who they belong to be true custodians of those objects.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to be very, very short. What I want us to realize also is the mental slavery that we underwent. You know, I can sit here and say, can you hear me? Oh, okay. I can sit here and say I'm a liberated woman. I am not colonized anymore, whatever. But what we were brought up with, we grew up under colonialism, and it was engraved in our minds that even if I say I'm not a Christian, there will come a time when I say, oh my God, oh Jesus help me, or because it's in my mind. So if we do not, like Esther said, do research, more research on that, and free ourselves totally from that, we will also, it will also flow over to our children, even though we claim that we are not colonized anymore. The mental slavery, the mental colonialism, I don't know what the word will be there. Psychologically, we are still, we still feel everything white or everything that the colonizers do are better than our own. It is still engraved in our minds. So unless we free ourselves there and talk about freely and do more research on it, we will always be mentally colonized, is all I wanted to say.
Just very quickly in response to that, I lived and worked for a couple of years in a community in northern Canada in which there were a population of about 3,500, and there were 6 denominations of Christianity, each with its own legacy of trying to convert or harvest the souls of those people who were there in the community. They can't all have been, and they're continually fighting with one another. So it produced a source of division within the community. And that division carries over into their response to all kinds of things, including repatriation of artifacts and how to deal with government. So it affected everything in the communities. And I'm quite sure that similar circumstances exist in Africa and everywhere that colonial governments, together with missionaries engaged in colonial efforts, it created very serious divisions that are lasting until today. And I think you're quite right that one of the struggles involved in overcoming this legacy is getting past those divisions that incapacitate communities, that keep them from functioning politically.
And I think just quickly that when we're looking at decolonization, we can't do this alone. That we need to learn from each other's experiences and learn where we've succeeded and where we've failed in other cases. I know this from home in the modern day Aboriginal rights movement. We took ideas from all across the world in decolonization processes, in resistance, and we took them and adapted them to how they were local. We need to remember that we're not alone. And we never were. We still have stories of the vast majority of the world. England discovered a place already called New Holland, a place that had hieroglyphs in the New South Wales headlands when Tutankhamun had boomerangs in his tomb, where China remembers the stories of us, where the tribes of Northern America have stories of our red warriors of the centre of Australia. We were never alone. We need to remember our histories together and find strength in each other too.